This is question number 10, arrow notation. You've got 4 of these blanks to fill out of your test, although I gave you 6 that we're going to practice with. Okay, the first one. What happens as x approaches -1? And do you see this little minus sign right there? That means -1 on the left. Okay, so this is a left side of the asymptote. So if I look at -1, it's nice if you put an L and an R so you know your left and your right. If you notice, I'm going to ask you one from the left, and then I'll also ask you one from the right. And so that means that on the left side, the arrow points upwards, which means our answer will be positive infinity. But on the right side, the arrow points downwards, so our behavior is negative infinity. Then we're going to study what happens at 3. We're going to look at what happens at 3. If you see here, that little negative sign, this means what's happening to the left of 3. And see that little positive sign, that means what's happening to the right of 3. So here's 3. We have a vertical asymptote there. We have an L and an R. On the left, the arrow points downwards to negative infinity. But on the right of 3, the arrow points upwards to positive infinity. Then finally, they ask what happens when x approaches negative infinity. X approaches negative infinity is on this side of the graph. And what does the arrow do? Does the arrow point towards a value, or does the arrow point up, or does the arrow point down? Well, the arrow is always going to point towards your asymptote. So the asymptote is at 1. I would say the arrow is pointing towards 1 because that's where this asymptote is, right here at 1. As x approaches positive infinity, this is positive infinity over here, it looks like we're approaching 1 as well. And for our purposes, these will always be the same. Okay, when you're doing the negative infinity and the positive infinity, they're always going to be the exact same thing. Now, I don't know, as I'm looking at this graph, I think I might have made a typo, and I think maybe this asymptote should have been here. Doesn't it kind of look like it's approaching 2 a little better than it is 1? Well, I think it probably is. I think I slid that down, but since the asymptote is at 1, I'm just going to assume that in the long run, it's going to approach 1. I don't know. It kind of looks like it approaches 2. I hope that makes sense. That's all for arrow notation. You only have to do 4 blanks on your test.